Hello and welcome to my tutorial all about how to make this 3D papercraft project. As you can see, it looks kind of like an exotic jungle flower, and what I was aiming for is a kind of 3D explosion of paper. This project took me about a day to make, but I was making a tutorial at the same time, and I did use 100 pieces of paper, which is a lot. You can obviously choose how many layers of paper to incorporate and what colours to use, so you can make your own completely unique piece of art. Okay, so what do you need for this project? Well, you will need paper. I used 100 sheets of A4, 80 GSM weight paper in a range of neon colours, as well as some black coloured paper. In hindsight, this was a few too many sheets of paper, because in the end product you can't see at least 20 of these layers in the centre of the flower. So I would say 75 sheets is the most you would want to use. Anywhere from 10 sheets of paper upwards would work, but I think 50 to 75 is what I would recommend. The more sheets you use, the more intricate the paper flower will be. Another thing you're going to need is glue. I used Aleene's tacky glue, which is basically PVA glue, and also a glue stick. There are other ways of joining paper sheets together if you don't want to use glue at all. For instance, using screw posts in each corner. So it's up to you, but I would say glue is probably the easiest method. You'll also need scissors, a metal ruler, a scrap piece of paper, an awl, a pen or pencil, a utility knife and cutting mat, and also a metal yarn needle. You'll also need small bulldog clips. I bought a pack of 10 of these and I used them all, so yes, they're very handy for this project. A couple of optional extras include a guillotine or paper cutter, and a frame or stand, which you may or may not want depending on how you want to display your finished art. And that's all you need to make this piece of paper art. I quite like the fact that they're all sort of basic general supplies, and therefore won't cost you very much to do. The first step is to cut all of the A4 sheets into square sheets of paper. If you have a guillotine, this shouldn't take you more than about 5 minutes. Otherwise, you'll need to use a utility knife and a metal ruler, or a pair of scissors. You can make a size guide out of a scrap piece of paper, fold it diagonally, then fold the excess rectangle shape on the side of the fold, and then cut off that rectangle shape. And that leaves you with a perfect square of paper. If you wish, you can use this template to cut the other pieces of paper to the same size. However, even if you don't need to use the template now, I recommend making it anyway because you will be needing it later on in the process. At the end of this step, you should have a lot of paper squares that are all the same size. The next step is to take the paper template that you've just made and finish it by adding a few more details to it. The first thing you need to do is fold it diagonally in the direction where there isn't already a fold. And this will find the centre point of the piece of paper. Mark the centre point with your pen. Then fold the piece of paper vertically and horizontally. And that'll give you 4 folds in total on the piece of paper. You are now going to draw pen lines along each of these 4 fold lines. So take your ruler and pen and draw a line going from the centre point outwards. Each of these 8 lines will start at the centre point and will each measure 3 inches long. These lines will be the petal cutting lines, and they will create 8 petals per sheet of paper. When you've finished, you should have a kind of symmetrical star shape, as shown here. The next step is to stack the papers. So you're going to take all of your paper squares and you're going to put them in the order that you want them to be in the final project. I wanted black and pink to alternate at the beginning, and then the rest of the colours to alternate after that. but it's completely up to you what kind of order you want your colours in. You then place the paper template on top of the stack and make sure that all of the sides of the paper stack line up neatly. At this point, take the bottom layer of paper and put it to one side because you're going to need that in the very last step. You're then going to make a hole straight through the centre of all of these paper squares. You use one hand to keep the paper stack all still and neat, whilst you use your other hand to take the awl and push and twist it into the centre of the paper. Twist it vertically through all the paper squares. You can break up the paper stack into multiple piles if you wish, because then it's more manageable and you can put a hole in each of the piles individually, so you're not doing the whole stack at once. If you're doing this, make sure that you know how to stack those paper piles together again in the right order. The next stage requires the metal yarn needle, and you need to push this up through the paper stack, going from the bottom of the stack upwards. You want the wider base of the needle, where the eye is, to be flush with the bottom piece of paper, so that you can sit the paper stack flat on your cutting surface. The whole point of this step is to join your paper squares together temporarily in the centre with the needle. This will allow you to pivot those paper squares around that centre point. Obviously, because you've got the sharp end of the needle pointing upwards, be careful during this step. You then need to pick a direction, either clockwise or anti-clockwise, and that is the direction you're going to go in throughout this next stage. You need to pivot or rotate each of the paper squares around the needle by a small fraction, so that basically the paper will be going in a spiral shape. To do this, you need to lift up the side of the stack slightly and then pivot all but the bottom piece of paper slightly around the needle. Then you do the same for the next piece of paper by keeping it in the same place but pivoting the rest of the paper. So you keep pivoting the stack around and around the needle by the same amount each time, and you keep dropping another piece of paper at each fraction of a turn. You'll know you're doing it right when you start seeing this effect, where the corners of the paper squares are spaced evenly and are forming a spiral pattern. Once you've finished, it should look something like this, with all of the corners spaced out about the same amount, going around and around the circumference. The next thing you need to do is thread the paper template onto the needle so that it sits on the top of the stack and lines up with the top piece of paper. You then take the small bulldog clips or other type of clip and add them to the edges to hold all of the papers together. Just make sure that when you're adding the clips around the circumference that you don't accidentally squash the corners of the papers. And once all of those pieces of paper are secure, we go on to the next step, which is where we cut through all of the papers. So remove the needle first from the centre of the stack, and then make sure the stack is on a cutting surface. You need to cut along the 4 lines that you've drawn on the paper template, so that these cuts transfer to every piece of paper underneath. I decided to make the cuts in 8 parts rather than 4, so I didn't do the full line all across the paper. I just cut from the outside points towards the centre point, and I did that 8 times. The reason I did this rather than doing the longer lines all in one go is because by going towards the centre point only and not away from the centre point, I run less of a risk of snagging those pointy bits in the centre. And since those pointy bits are the ones that are going to be on display, you don't want to tear them or snag them. So I started with one of the 8 shorter lines, used my metal ruler and utility knife, and just cut over and over again, going from the outside point to the center point, going deeper and deeper into the paper stack. I did this until I felt I couldn't go any further down, and then I moved on to the next line, and I did this all the way around the template. So I cut 8 short lines. I then needed to check how many pieces of paper these cuts had transferred to, because it's unlikely you will have gone fully through the stack unless you're using relatively few pieces of paper. So I briefly and carefully took about half of the bulldog clips off so I could have a look. I had cut at least halfway through the stack, so I put more bulldog clips on the lower pile of paper that hadn't been cut yet, and I put the rest of the bulldog clips on the upper pile of paper and moved that pile to one side for later. It's very important that when you put the pile of papers that you've cut to one side, that they stay in exactly the same orientation. And you have to remember how these piles of paper are going to be restacked later on. The best way to do this is to choose a corner, for instance the bottom left corner, and put a pen mark on each of the paper piles in this bottom left corner. That way you know how to line them up and join them up correctly later. So just carry on doing that, cutting into each pile of paper until you've cut through all the pieces of paper. As long as all of the cuts have mostly transferred to the paper, then that's totally fine. Don't worry if the cuts don't fully come through, especially around the center point. It's likely that on some pieces of paper, the cuts won't join up in the middle. So just don't worry about that, we'll sort that out later. Once the cuts have been made, you need to rejoin the piles of paper back together again. So I remove the bulldog clips from one pile and carefully line the sides of the paper up again by rotating the papers all in the same direction, which is the opposite direction, by the way, to what you used to spin the papers in a previous step. The idea is that you want the papers to be stacked exactly how they were prior to rotating and cutting them. And then you do the same with the other piles of paper. You then use the pen mark that you made before to join the piles up in the correct orientation. And that will make a nice, neat pile of papers again. At this point, I highly recommend that you mark every single piece of paper in the same corner. So you pick one corner, and then on every piece of paper you put a little mark with a pen or marker pen, and that means in future steps you'll have no problem putting all the pieces of paper back together again in the correct orientation. The next stage is the stage that requires most patience, because what we're going to do is neaten up the cuts. Depending on the number of sheets you're using, this could take a little while, so it's a good activity for in front of the TV. All you need to do is get your scissors, and on any sheet where the cuts don't quite line up or meet up in the center point, you're going to cut these yourself individually. The aim is to get all of the papers looking pretty much the same, and you want to neaten up all of the paper points in the center, so that the end display will look really nice and smart. Here you can see a particularly messy one, and this is what I did to it to neaten it up. Just make sure to keep the papers in the correct order throughout. Once you've done that, neaten up the paper stack so that all the edges line up nice and neatly. Then remove the top piece of paper and put it to one side. I did not do this, and during the gluing process I got a bit of stray glue on my front page, which wasn't a good look and I had to remake it. So this is just an extra tip. Take the front page off and leave it to one side to protect it from any stray glue. I put the paper template back on top of the stack just to add a bit of protection from the glue, but it didn't really work, so you don't need to do this. Just ignore the fact that some of the paper petals are already curled up. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Next, you need to add the bulldog clips to 2 of the sides of the paper stack, as shown here. We're going to glue the paper sheets together, 2 sides at a time. Make sure the bulldog clips are right at the edge of the sides they're on. I'm going to use Aleene's tacky glue for this, but you can use any PVA glue, and I'm going to use a scrap piece of cardboard as the glue spreader. So I simply put the glue along one of the exposed edges, making sure to get a good layer. I use my DIY glue spreader to spread the glue all over the edge, making sure that it comes into contact with every sheet of paper. You want the glue in quite a thin layer all over, and then you can use the spreader just to tidy up the glue and remove it from the front and back of the stack. I then added bulldog clips onto the stack just to squash those paper edges together, and I tried to keep the clips from making too much contact with the glue. I then did exactly the same on the opposing side, and then I left it to dry. Once those sides were dry, I did exactly the same for the remaining 2 sides of the stack. And then once all 4 edges are glued together and dried, you can move on to the next step. As mentioned before, I got glue on my front page, so at this point I just simply replicated it and replaced it. But you just need to take your front page from wherever you put it and now stick it onto the front of your paper stack. The best way to do this is to use a glue stick. And now we get on to the most fun part, I think, where we curl up the paper points and we get to see the flower emerge from the paper. So all you do is simply take one of the paper points on the front page and curl it outwards. So I hold the point and I use my other hand to carefully add a curl as I pull the paper outwards. I do this all the way around, rotating the paper stack as I go. You're going to do 8 petals per page, and then you're going to move on to the next page. And then you do exactly the same thing. So you take the paper point and curl it outwards. And again, rotate the paper stack as you work. After about 20 or so paper layers, it's going to get a bit more difficult because it's going to get more fiddly to add the curl to the petals. Just try and keep adding the curl to the petals for as long as you can until it just gets too fiddly to do. So once you get onto the middle layers, all you'll be able to do really is pick up the paper point and carefully fold it outwards and simply just squash it against the other petals. So you pick up the paper point, fold outwards and squash. You then repeat this all through the paper layers. When you get to the very bottom layers, you'll find that you'll have to use your fingernails to pick up those paper points and fold them outwards. As a very last step, you should get the paper square that you set aside earlier and stick it to the bottom of the paper stack using the glue stick. And then your paper art is completed. Well done for finishing. I know it can take a bit of patience. I really hope you've enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.